A poor mechanic fixed a woman's car at midnight. The next day, 3 black SUVs pulled up to his garage. Have you ever met someone whose silence said more than 1,000 words? Someone who wasn't trying to be found but ended up changing your life forever? This is a story about a quiet man with a garage full of rusted tools and an even rustier heart, and a woman who walked in from the cold, not just to fix her car, but to find a place to belong. What happens when 2 people, both lost in their own ways, stumble into each other's lives? Can kindness repair what grief has worn down? Can love find its way in through the cracks we try so hard to seal? You're about to hear a story of quiet courage, second chances, and the kind of healing that comes not in grand gestures, but in shared silence, strong coffee, and ordinary mornings that become extraordinary. If stories like this speak to you, gentle, heartwarming tales about real people, real love, and the quiet power of hope, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find these stories, and it means the world to me. Now settle in, take a breath, and let me tell you the story of the quiet garage, the loud heart. The town of Willoughby had a way of settling into silence after sunset. Not the eerie kind, but a quiet that came from contentment. Rows of old clapboard houses lined the snow-dusted streets, and the distant hum of the river echoed like a lullaby in the hills. Folks went to bed early there, or at least stayed indoors once the sun dipped low behind the pine trees, all except one man. Frank Mercer stood at the mouth of his garage, arms crossed, a steaming mug of instant coffee in hand. His overalls were worn at the elbows, grease-stained and faded, but clean. He always kept them clean. His late wife used to tease him that he was the only man in town who ironed his work clothes. The garage was small, more like a glorified shed tucked beside an old gas station that hadn't pumped fuel in over a decade. But it was his, and more than that, it was familiar. That night, the snow had started falling just after 6. By 8, the town had tucked itself under a white blanket. It was nearing midnight now, and the only lights on Main Street were his, warm and amber through the garage windows. Frank didn't expect anyone. He never did. At 62, solitude had become his closest companion, and most nights passed without more company than the soft static of an old AM radio. But then, out of the thick hush of falling snow, came the sound of tires, crunching, sputtering, then coughing to a stop. He turned slowly, brows furrowing. A sleek black car, not from around here, had limped its way to the curb just outside his garage. The engine gave one last shudder before going silent. Steam hissed from beneath the hood. Frank didn't move. Right away. Something about the sudden intrusion made him cautious. City car, low-profile tires. Too clean for these parts. The driver's door cracked open, and a woman stepped out. She wasn't young, but she moved like someone who had once been. Tall, wrapped in a long wool coat, her boots ill-suited for the snow. Her hat was crooked, her scarf not quite tied. She looked not lost exactly, but adrift. Frank set his mug down. "You all right there, ma'am?" She looked up, startled at first, then relieved. "I think my radiator blew, or the thermostat, I'm not sure. It just started steaming and, well, here I am." She gave a half laugh, the kind people make when they're trying to pretend they're not shaken. Frank approached slowly, hands visible. "Let me take a look." Up close, she smelled faintly of jasmine and cold air. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed him the keys. "I'm Frank," he said without ceremony, popping the hood. "Lillian," she replied, hugging herself. "I was trying to make it to Duluth before morning, but I think the weather had other plans." Frank grunted in acknowledgement. The engine was overheating, classic signs of a stuck thermostat. Not a tough fix, but he'd have to let things cool before replacing it. "You're not making it to Duluth tonight," he said, matter of fact. "You'd be lucky to make it to the diner 2 blocks down." Lillian looked back at her car, then at the dark street. "I guess I should have checked the forecast. You from around here?" No, she said, then added, just passing through. He didn't ask more. She didn't offer. You can come inside, warm up while I see what I can do. Lillian hesitated. Are you sure? I don't want to. Suit yourself, Frank said, already walking back to the garage. She followed. Inside, the garage was cleaner than most would expect. The concrete floor had been swept, tools lined neatly along the walls, and an old wood-burning stove crackled in the corner. It smelled faintly of oil and pine. Frank handed her a chipped ceramic mug. Coffee's not good, but it's hot, she smiled gratefully. I'll take it. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the snow whispering against the windows. Frank worked under the hood while she stood nearby, watching quietly. You live here long? She asked eventually. Born and raised, left for a while, came back. Why? He shrugged. Sometimes the world out there's too loud. She nodded, eyes distant. I know what you mean. Something in her tone, a thread of weariness. It caught his ear, but again he didn't press. Your thermostat's stuck. I can fix it, but I'll need it to cool down. Give it 30-40 minutes. Thank you, Frank. Really, I didn't know where I was going to end up tonight. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the strain around her eyes, the subtle slump in her posture. She wasn't just tired from the drive. Sit a while, he said. No sense standing around in the cold. She did. The silence that followed was oddly comfortable. Your garage, she said after a while, it feels peaceful. Frank chuckled. That's because no one comes here after 5 p.m. I think I needed peaceful. He didn't respond, just handed her a small wool blanket he kept in the office for the occasional late-night tow. By the time he finished the repair, the snow had thickened, turning the world outside into a soft blur of white and shadow. You sure you want to drive tonight? He asked. Roads'll be slick. She looked out the window. Her fingers tightened around the mug. Then, almost inaudibly, no, I suppose I'm not in a hurry anymore. Frank handed her the keys. There's a spare cot in the back room. I don't usually offer it, but well, it's there if you want it, no strings. Lillian blinked, surprised by the offer, and something in her expression softened. Thank you. That's very kind. Frank shrugged. Sometimes people just need a place to be. He didn't sleep much that night. Something about her presence, the way she had looked at the snow, not with wonder but with quiet resignation, stirred something long buried. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition, like finding a familiar melody in the middle of a new song. And though he didn't know it yet, the quiet garage would never be the same again. The night stretched long and cold, but inside the garage, the crackling of the wood stove and the low hum of Frank's space heater lent a kind of warmth that went beyond temperature. It wasn't cozy exactly, but it was safe. Lillian sat on the worn bench along the back wall, still wrapped in the wool blanket Frank had offered. She hadn't said much since agreeing to stay the night. Neither had he. Frank wasn't used to company, much less at midnight. Yet somehow, her presence didn't feel like an intrusion. She wasn't asking questions, poking around, or fidgeting with her phone like most people would. She just sat, quiet, watching him work. Every so often, their eyes met and there was a shared understanding. Not romantic, not yet, just something simple and human. We're both here. He crouched beneath the hood of her car, tools moving with practiced precision. The new thermostat clicked into place with satisfying ease. The radiator cap hissed steam as he loosened it, then tightened it again. His hands knew what to do. They always had. It was one of the few things that still made sense in a world that had stopped making much of it. Behind him, Lillian finally spoke. You're good at that, she said softly. Frank didn't look up. 40 years will do that to you. You were in the military? He gave a small nod. Army, motor pool. Spent most of my time under Humvees in the desert. That must have been hard. He wiped his hands on a rag, straightened slowly. It was just work. Hotter, louder, fewer decent tools. She smiled faintly. You talk like a man who doesn't like to dwell. He considered that. Not much use in it. There was a long pause before she asked, "What about your wife?" He turned then. His eyes met hers, still and unreadable. She passed. 10 years ago. I'm sorry. He nodded, then returned to his tools. Me too. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent in a way, like the space around them had become a kind of sanctuary, unspoken grief hanging in the air like incense. Lillian looked down at her coffee cup, now empty. I lost someone too. Frank didn't answer, didn't ask who or when. He didn't need to. Loss had a sound, and it was in her voice. Instead, he said, "You can sleep in the office. It's warmer, there's a cot, a couple of extra blankets. I don't want to put you out. You're not. You barely know me." Frank turned off the overhead light, leaving the soft orange glow of the stove. "Sometimes that's easier." She didn't respond, just stood slowly, blanket still wrapped around her, and followed him to the back. The office was small, half storage space, half makeshift living quarters. A dusty bookshelf lined one wall, a small cot pressed against the other. There was a photo on the desk, slightly faded, a woman with kind eyes, hair caught mid-laugh, standing next to a younger, cleaner-shaven Frank. Lillian glanced at it, then away. He handed her a second blanket and paused. "There's a bolt on the inside of the door," he said, "just in case you'd rather be sure." Lillian looked up at him. "Thank you for everything." Frank hesitated, then gave her a small nod and stepped back into the garage, closing the door gently behind him. He lay on his own cot, just outside in the workroom, staring at the rafters. The wind outside had picked up, snow whispering against the tin roof. He could hear the faint creak of the office floor as Lillian settled in. He thought of how quiet she'd been, not nervous quiet, but intentional. She was carrying something. That much was obvious, but it wasn't his business to dig. He'd learned long ago that some wounds bled more when exposed. Still, there was something about her. Not just the way she spoke, measured like someone choosing each word carefully, but the way she looked at the world, as if she'd seen something she hadn't yet decided to believe in again. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Lillian didn't sleep much either. She lay on the cot, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling. The stove's warmth didn't quite reach the corners of the room, and the quiet left too much space for her thoughts. She had left Minneapolis that morning without telling anyone. Not her son, not her sister. Just packed a bag, grabbed the keys to the old Lexus and drove. At the time, it had felt bold. Now, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow, in a stranger's garage, it felt like something else. But Frank hadn't asked questions, hadn't pried or judged, just helped, just existed, calm and grounded and human. She looked again at the photograph on the desk. The woman looked warm, not just pretty but kind. No wonder Frank still kept it close. Lillian wondered if anyone still kept a photo of her. She pulled the blanket tighter, blinking against the warmth in her eyes. She hadn't cried in months, not when the therapist told her she was clinically exhausted, not when her son gently suggested a trip to a wellness retreat, not even when she walked out of her front door, unsure if she'd return. But now, in this quiet place, the stillness cracked something open. She cried softly, silently, not out of sadness, but out of relief. By the time morning painted the garage in soft grey light, Frank was already up. He didn't wake her, just put on the coffee and stood at the door, watching the snowfall ease into gentle flakes. Something about the day felt different, not dramatic, just softer. When Lillian finally emerged, her hair slightly tousled, blanket folded neatly. In her arms, she gave him a look he couldn't quite read. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded. They sat in silence again, sipping from mismatched mugs. "Did you sleep?" he asked eventually. "A little," she said. "Enough." Frank nodded. "The car's ready. You can leave whenever you're ready." Lillian looked. Out the window. The roads were clearer now. She could go, she should go, but she didn't move. Instead, she asked, "Do you always keep the garage open this late?" "Not usually." "Why last night?" He thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Felt like someone might need it." Lillian smiled. Small, but real. And for the first time in a long while, Frank smiled back. The sun crept over the ridges like it was in no hurry, spilling light onto the sleepy streets of Willoughby. A soft wind swept through the town, nudging the overnight snow into little swirls that danced lazily down the sidewalks. The old clock on the town hall struck 8, and somewhere a dog barked once before going quiet again. Frank sipped his coffee by the garage window, eyes tracking the slow rhythm of a small town waking up. He hadn't said much since Lillian joined him, and she didn't seem to mind. She sat across from him, both hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the same world pass by in silence. It was a companionable kind of quiet, the kind that asks for nothing but presence. "I should probably get back on the road," she said. Eventually, her voice reluctant, like it was betraying her body. Frank glanced at her. "Roads are better now." Lillian gave a soft laugh. "You don't say much, do you?" "I say what's needed," he replied, not unkindly. She stood, stretching, slowly, and reached for her coat. "Thank you again, Frank, for everything." He just nodded. As she stepped toward the door, he added, "Take care, Lillian." Something in the way he said her name made her pause, but she didn't turn around, just smiled, half to herself, and walked into the cold morning air. He thought, and that would be the end of it. People passed through Willoughby all the time. Well, not a lot of people and not often, but often enough that Frank had learned how to let them go. Lillian was kind, gentle in her demeanor, but she was clearly someone used to moving on. He figured she'd disappear into the miles like most did, and for an hour or so, life returned to its routine. He opened the garage bay, cleaned off the tool bench, and started a diagnostic on a local teacher's sputtering Ford. The radio mumbled along with a country station too faint to really catch, and the heater kicked on and off with a clunky. Kept meaning to fix. Then, at 9:17 a.m., 3 black SUVs rolled down Main Street. Frank didn't notice them right away. He was under the Ford's hood when the low rumble of the engines brought a rare stillness to the block. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, watching as the vehicles pulled to a stop right outside his garage. They were spotless, shiny like showroom models, with dark tinted windows and plates he didn't recognize. Not local that much was obvious. The lead SUV's engine turned off first, followed by the others in perfect sync, like some kind of mechanical choreography. Frank's stomach tightened. Something about the precision, the silence, the sheer presence of them. It didn't sit right. The front driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Late 30s, maybe 40, tall, clean-cut, dressed in dark jeans and a weatherproof jacket with no logo. He moved with purpose, the kind of purpose Frank remembered from his military days. Controlled, confident. Frank folded his arms across his chest. "Can I help you?" he asked, not moving from the garage threshold. The man offered a polite smile, but didn't extend a hand. "We're looking for a woman. Name's Lillian Hart." Frank's jaw tensed. He didn't answer. "She was here last night?" The man continued. "Car trouble? We tracked the vehicle here." Frank narrowed his eyes. "She left this morning. Didn't say where she was headed." The man studied him. Not hostile, but something sharper than polite. Assessing. "You a friend of hers?" "I'm a mechanic." The man nodded, then gestured to one of the other SUVs. Another man approached, carrying a tablet. He tapped on it, turned it, and showed Frank a photo. Lillian, mid-conversation, candid but clear. Seen her? Frank stared at the image longer than he needed to, then said, "Yep, same lady, she's not here." She say anything? Mention where she was going? Frank met the man's gaze. Nope. The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Finally, the man gave a nod, signaling to the others. They didn't linger. No threats, no questions asked twice. Just a polite thank you and 3 black SUVs rolling away as smoothly as they'd arrived. Frank stood at the edge of the garage, jaw tight, the air thick around him. He didn't return to the Ford right away. Instead, he poured another cup of coffee with a hand that wasn't quite steady and sat at his desk, staring at nothing in particular. Who the hell was Lillian Hart? He didn't believe in coincidences, not at his age. The woman shows up out of nowhere, drives a luxury car unsuited for snow, carries the kind of stillness that only comes from long exposure to grief or guilt. And less than 10 hours later, men in black SUVs come asking polite but pointed questions. Something didn't sit right, but the strangest part wasn't the men or their vague civility. It was how Frank felt about it, concerned, not curious, concerned. He barely knew her. She'd spent a night under his roof, drank his bad coffee, and left like the wind, but something about her had landed in him, like a song stuck in the back of the mind. He remembered her eyes, tired, but not defeated. He remembered how she looked at the world, like someone trying to remember what it felt like to belong in it. And he remembered the way she folded the blanket that morning, as though she wanted to leave the space better than she found it. Not the behavior of someone dangerous, but maybe of someone hiding. The bell above the garage door jingled. Frank looked up, startled out of his thoughts. For a wild second he thought it might be her, but it was Carol from the bakery, holding a box of warm pastries. "Saw those government types out there?" she said, handing him the box. "They yours?" Frank snorted. "Don't think they belong to anyone." "Well, they sure don't belong here. Gave everyone the creeps." He took the box. "Thanks, Carol. You okay?" Frank hesitated, then nodded. Just thinking, Carol. Studied him for a beat longer than necessary. "Don't go poking into things that don't concern you, Frank." He didn't answer. That night, he stayed up later than usual. Didn't open the garage. Didn't fix the heater. Didn't return the bakery box to Carol. He just sat in the soft light of the stove, the radio quiet, and stared at the photo of his wife on the desk. She'd always had a way of reading people. Said some folks were like radio signals. You didn't need to understand everything about them to know they were trying to reach someone. Lillian was one of those people, and Frank wasn't so sure she should be out there alone. Frank hadn't expected to see her again. He'd told himself that from the start. People passed through. They left. They had their reasons. That was the way of things. But in the quiet that followed the black SUVs and Carol's careful warning, the space she'd occupied in his garage, and maybe a little in his mind, didn't fill itself back in. He found himself glancing at the road more than usual, leaving the porch light on longer than necessary, listening for unfamiliar engines. Still, it was 3 days before she returned. It was a Wednesday morning. The sky had cleared. The snow had crusted into bright, hard banks along the sidewalks, and the cold had sharpened its edge. Frank was tightening the alternator belt on a rusted-out Chevy pickup when he heard the tires crunch against the drive. He didn't look up right away. Let her come to him. When he finally did lift his gaze, there she was, coat buttoned, scarf neatly knotted this time, cheeks touched with color. She held a white paper bag in one hand, a cardboard drink carrier in the other. "You're early," Frank said, straightening. "Garage doesn't open till 9. "I know," Lillian replied. "This isn't a service call." She held out the bag. "Apple fritters. I thought maybe you still took sugar in your coffee." He raised a brow but took the offering. "Still do." She smiled, and it was softer than before, less guarded. Frank stepped aside, motioning her in. Stove's lit. Come warm up. Inside, she settled into the same bench by the wall as before, removing her gloves and wrapping her fingers around the coffee. Frank poured himself a mug, then opened the bag. These from Carol's? She still wakes up at 4. Some things never change. Frank took a bite. The sugar clung to his fingers, the dough still warm. They came looking for you, he said finally, wiping his hand with a shop rag. I figured. Frank looked over. They didn't say who they were. I know who they were. He waited. She didn't elaborate. I didn't tell them anything, he added. Lillian looked at him, eyes unreadable. Thank you. Silence again. Not hostile, just filled with things unsaid. Wasn't sure you'd come back, Frank said after a moment. I wasn't sure either, she admitted. But the coffee's better than I remembered. He chuckled once. Still not good. I've had worse. She sipped quietly for a while, then turned to face him more fully. Frank, she said softly, do you ever disappear? He blinked. What do you mean? I don't mean physically, I mean inside, like you're still here, still, doing the motions. But there's a part of you that's just gone, like you stepped away from yourself and didn't know how to come back. Frank studied her. There was something different in her now, not fear, not even sadness, but exposure, a willingness to be seen. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, after my wife died, I didn't talk to anyone for 4 months. I came here every day, worked on cars, no one asked me to fix, drank coffee I didn't taste, nights I just sat, stared at the clock, couldn't tell you what I was waiting for. Lillian didn't move, just listened. I wasn't angry, I wasn't crying, I wasn't anything, just not there. That's what I meant, she said quietly. He met her gaze. You too? She nodded. I used to be someone. I mean, I had a life, career, husband, people relied on me. And then one day it all felt heavy, like everything I'd built was resting on my chest. My husband died, and everyone told me to take time. But the truth is, I'd already left before he did. Emotionally, spiritually, I just never found my way back. She folded her hands together. Her voice grew quieter. My son got worried. I started therapy, did the whole wellness retreat routine, and then last week I just got in the car and drove. Looking for something? Frank asked. I didn't know. Maybe a place to stop running. Frank looked down at the floor. You could have picked a better place than Willoughby, she smiled. Maybe, or maybe not. The wind rattled the windows gently, like fingers tapping to be let in. Frank poured more coffee. This time, he brought it to her first. She accepted it like a peace offering, their fingers brushing briefly. You ever think about leaving? She asked. Frank leaned against the workbench. I did. After Anna died. Thought about moving closer. To my daughter in Arizona. But I didn't like the heat, or the noise, or the traffic, he shrugged. This place has ghosts, but at least they're mine. Lillian studied him a long time. You ever talk about her? Frank shook his head. Not really. She didn't press. Later, when the sky began to shift from pale blue to silver grey, she stood and pulled on her gloves again. I should go, she said. Frank nodded, brushing off his hands. But I think I'll be back tomorrow, she added. He didn't smile, but his voice softened. Garage opens at 9. I'll bring better coffee. Hard to imagine worse. She paused at the door. Thank you, Frank, for letting me talk. I don't do that often. Neither do I. Her hand lingered on the doorknob. That photo on your desk. She was beautiful. She was kind, he said quietly. That's what I miss the most. Lillian nodded once, gently, and then she was gone, the bell over the door chiming softly in her wake. That evening, Frank didn't turn on the radio, didn't pour his usual after-dinner bourbon. He just sat by the stove, watching the orange light flicker against the walls of his garage. He thought of Lillian's voice, steady, deliberate, raw in its honesty. And he thought of how strange it was to feel a quiet kinship with someone you barely knew. It wasn't romantic, not in the way most people thought of love. But it was something, a bridge between two people who understood the weight of silence. And maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. By the end of the week, Lillian had become a fixture in the garage. Not every hour, not every day, but enough that her presence no longer surprised Frank. She brought coffee that was marginally better, pastries that kept his hands sticky, and conversation that came in gentle waves. Never too much, never too little. She didn't hover, didn't distract him from his work. Mostly she sat on the bench by the stove, reading a novel with a broken spine or thumbing through old magazines. Frank hadn't bothered to throw away, but occasionally their words drifted toward each other and settled into a rhythm that neither had expected. It was a kind of quiet companionship, like two birds choosing the same stretch of fence for a while. No promises, just presence, but peace has a strange fragility. It can be broken not by violence or words, but by the weight of what is hidden. It happened on a grey Thursday afternoon. The clouds hung low, pregnant with snow, and Frank was fixing the alternator on a dusty Buick from 2 towns over. Lillian had gone out earlier that morning. Just a drive, she said, and Frank, in the lull of her absence, turned to the passenger seat of her car to move it into the bay for a quick tune-up. It was innocent. Or so he thought, as he slid into the leather seat and reached for the keys tucked under the visor. A slim, worn notebook fell from the center console and landed on the floor with a soft thud. Frank bent to pick it up, intending only to place it back where it belonged. But when he touched it, the cover shifted open just slightly, and something caught his eye, a name. His name, his full name, Franklin J. Mercer. He froze. Below it, in smaller handwriting, cleaner, more deliberate, was a single line. There. Is something still alive in him? Frank's fingers curled around the edges of the book, the hum of the heater, the ticking of the garage clock, the wind outside. It all faded under the rush of unease that pulsed in his ears. She'd written about him, and not just in passing. She'd been thinking about him, noting things. He closed the notebook carefully, almost reverently, and placed it back exactly where it had fallen, but the damage had been done. He stood beside the car, hands still, breath slow, eyes fixed on the dashboard like it might offer an answer. Lillian returned an hour later, cheeks pink from the cold, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and a small bag from the bookstore. "Hope you didn't finish off the whole box of donuts without me," she teased lightly as she stepped through the door. Frank didn't smile. She noticed immediately. "You all right?" He didn't look up from the engine. "Fine." Her brow furrowed, but she set the cups down and unwrapped her scarf slowly. "You sure? You seem—" Frank closed the hood with more force than necessary. "You wrote about me," he said flatly, still not facing her. The words hung between them like cold air. Lillian's breath caught. "You went through my things?" "No. It fell out. Your notebook." Her face drained of color. She stepped forward, then paused. "Frank, I didn't mean you wrote my name, said something was still alive in me." He turned, his voice quiet but firm. "What does that mean?" Lillian blinked, suddenly looking smaller. "It was just a note, a thought. I wasn't keeping tabs or anything." "Then why write it down?" "Because—" She faltered, then exhaled. "Because I've spent the last few months surrounded by people who looked at me and saw someone broken, someone they needed to fix. But when I met you, I didn't feel broken anymore. I saw something in you, something steady, something good. And for a moment I felt like I could trust that steadiness." Frank looked away. "You should have told me." "I didn't expect to stay," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought I was just passing through. That notebook, it's how I process things, feelings, people. I wrote about a dozen places, faces. Yours just happened to stay with me." Frank said nothing. His jaw worked against some unspoken tension. "I'm sorry." she added, if it felt like a violation. He finally met her eyes. There was no anger in his, only something older, more weathered. A mix of hurt and caution. "You want to know why it hit me like that?" he asked. "Because I've spent the last 10 years trying not to be seen, trying to keep the past where it belongs. You show up, drink my coffee, sit in my quiet, and suddenly I'm in someone's journal, like I'm part of a story I didn't ask to be in." Lillian's shoulders dropped. "You're right, I should have asked before writing about you." He exhaled slowly, the tension easing just slightly. "I'm not angry, just surprised." She nodded. "I understand." They stood in silence, for a long while. Eventually Frank walked to the stove, poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee, and stared at the wall for a moment before speaking again. "You said there was something alive in me." "Yes, funny," he said half to himself. "I was starting to feel that too." Lillian looked up, hopeful. "You were?" He nodded, then looked at her. Really looked. "But maybe that's the problem," he said gently. "We're both trying to come back from something, and maybe we don't know how to do it without holding on too tight." She bit her lip, eyes glistening. "Then let's not hold on too tight. Let's just let it be what it is. A quiet place. For now." Frank studied her, then gave a slow nod. "A quiet place," he repeated. Lillian smiled, small but genuine. "With decent coffee." He chuckled, the tension finally softening. That might be asking too much. That evening, long after she'd gone, Frank sat at his workbench and stared at the old radio dial. He didn't feel betrayed. He felt seen. And strangely, that frightened him more than anything else. But under the fear, beneath the rusted edges of old wounds, there was something else, a warmth. Maybe she was right. Maybe there was still something alive in him after all. The rain came unexpectedly. For weeks, snow had ruled the skies over Willoughby, but this afternoon the clouds broke open and released something softer. Not the sharp sting of sleet or the smothering weight of snow, but a gentle, steady rainfall that felt more like a whisper than a warning. Frank stood in the garage doorway, arms folded, watching the drops roll off the rusted hood of an old Pontiac. The scent of wet pavement and motor oil mingled in the air, oddly comforting. Lillian hadn't come by that morning, or the one before, and while Frank told himself it didn't mean anything, he'd felt the silence in his chest more than he cared to admit. He wasn't angry, not anymore, just unsettled. He hadn't meant to overreact, but something about seeing his name in that notebook, seeing himself through someone else's eyes for the first time in years, it had shaken something loose. And now the garage felt different, emptier. He turned back inside, grabbed a wrench off the workbench, and went to work on the stubborn alternator. The rain tapped against the windows like an old friend too nervous to knock. It was just past 4 when she appeared. No warning, no sound. Just the chime of the bell above the door and the soft scuff of wet boots on concrete. Frank looked up. Lillian stood in the entrance, rain clinging to her coat and damp strands of hair. She carried no coffee this time, no pastries, no small talk. Tucked into a paper bag, just herself. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she said. He put down the wrench. "But you did." She nodded. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the patter of rain on the roof. "Can we talk?" she asked. Frank motioned toward the bench by the stove. She walked over, unbuttoning her coat but not removing it, as if unsure how long she planned to stay. Frank sat opposite her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I came back because I owe you more than an apology," she said, voice low. "I owe you the truth." He didn't interrupt. "I wasn't entirely honest with you about who I am, about why I came here." She exhaled. "I didn't just drive out of grief. I ran." Frank tilted his head slightly, waiting. "My husband Didn't die in his sleep like I told you, she said. He took his own life 2 years ago. Frank's brow furrowed, but he remained quiet. He had been struggling for a long time. Depression, anxiety, a job that crushed him. And her voice cracked. I missed it. I was too wrapped up in appearances, in managing the outside of our life, to see what was breaking on the inside. I was smiling at fundraisers while he was slipping through the cracks. She swallowed hard. When he died, people sent cards, flowers. They said things like, "He's at peace now, and time heals." But none of it landed. None of it touched the guilt that lodged itself in me like a splinter. And then one day it all just stopped meaning anything. I stopped meaning anything, to myself, to the world. Frank's gaze never left her. My son tried to help. He's a good man, but he doesn't know how to sit in sadness. He wants solutions, so he booked me into a place in Vermont, wellness center, therapists, nature walks, journaling prompts. It helped a little, but it didn't bring me back. She looked up at him then, eyes shimmering. I thought if I could just disappear, just drive without a destination, maybe I'd land somewhere that felt real. And I ended up here, at your garage. Frank sat back, the words settling over him like dust. He could feel her pain, not just in her voice, but in the way her shoulders folded inward, the way her fingers twisted in her lap. "You didn't scare me," he said at last. She blinked, surprised. "What?" "That day with the notebook. You didn't scare me." "What scared me was how right you were, about me, about something still being alive." Lillian breathed out slowly, her hands still. "I haven't let anyone look at me in a long time," she admitted. "Not really. And then you, this quiet, stubborn, grease-covered man, saw right through me with barely a word." Frank chuckled, softly. "You make that sound like a compliment." "It is," she said, smiling faintly. "The best kind." They sat like that for a while, the rain softening into a rhythmic lull outside, like applause from a faraway audience. Finally, Frank rose and poured them each a cup of coffee, reheated from the pot, bitter as ever. He handed her one. Lillian took it with a grateful nod. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked quietly. "After my wife passed." She nodded. He stared into his cup. "Because I wasn't finished with her." "Not really. There were things I wanted to say, things I never said. So I stayed here, in the garage, where she used to bring me lunch, where she used to lean against the doorframe and scold me for working too late." He glanced up. "I thought if I left, I'd lose what little of her I had left." Lillian's eyes softened. "But maybe staying kept you from finding what else might be waiting." Frank smiled, not broadly, but honestly. "Maybe." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. Hesitantly, she handed it to him. "What's this?" "A list," she said, "of all the things I've been too scared to say out loud." He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. There were only 3 lines. "I don't want to disappear anymore. I'm afraid to hope again. I'm starting to feel something, and I don't know what to do with it." Frank read it twice, then folded it and placed it in his chest pocket. Without a word. "You didn't laugh," she said softly. "Nothing funny about being honest." She smiled. "You still open at 9 tomorrow?" He looked at her, warmth rising behind his tired eyes. "Coffee's on at 8. That night Frank didn't lie awake like usual. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke to the scent of rain still in the air and the faintest sense that the garage and the man inside it had changed. And for the first time in a long time, he looked forward to morning. Frank had always been a man of routine. Wake up before the sun, black coffee by the stove, open the garage at 9 sharp, fix whatever rolled in, no matter how busted or broken, close up shop by 6, reheat something for dinner, radio, silence, sleep. He hadn't thought of it as loneliness. Not until recently. Not until Lillian. But on that Saturday morning, something shifted. He found himself straightening the shop before she arrived, stacking the loose oil filters, wiping down the counter, even swapping out the rag that had been draped over the coffee pot since Christmas. It was still dark outside when he started the coffee. By 8, the garage smelled faintly of fuel and fresh brew. Frank stood at the window, arms folded, watching the street for a sign of her, and then, just past 8:15, there she was, walking, not driving, coat cinched tight, carrying a paper bag and a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're early," Frank said as he opened the door. "So are you," she replied, stepping inside. "I never said I wouldn't be." "You never say much." He raised an eyebrow, motioned to the stove. "Coffee's hot." Miracles do happen. She handed him the bag, warm croissants and a pair of tiny jars, raspberry jam and honey butter. "We're upgrading breakfast," she said. "It's time." Frank looked at the jars, then at her. "Fancy." "I figure if I'm going to loiter in your garage like a stray cat, I might as well feed us properly." He chuckled softly. "Not sure you're a cat." She tilted her head. "No? You don't knock things off the shelves. Yet." Frank let out a real laugh, short, surprised, and entirely unplanned. He looked at her afterward, almost startled by the sound. Lillian froze, eyes wide in mock shock. "Was that a laugh?" "Don't get used to it." She grinned. "I was beginning to think you didn't know how." He poured her coffee, handing it over with a shrug. "Takes the right kind of joke." They sat together by the workbench, the morning sunlight creeping through the windows, slicing the garage into slivers of gold and shadow. Outside, the town was beginning to stir. Not loudly, but with the gentle rhythm of a weekend morning. In a place that still valued slow starts. Later, as Frank worked under the hood of an old Chevy, one of the few pickups older than his own, Lillian wandered around the garage, examining tools with curiosity. "What's this thing?" she asked, holding up a long, rusted contraption that looked like it belonged in a horror film. "Ball joint press." "For ball joints." She gave him a look. "Suspension," he clarified. "Holds the wheels steady. Keeps you from drifting." She nodded. "Important, then." More than people realize. She studied it a little longer, then set it down carefully. "Can I help?" Frank blinked. "With what?" "Whatever you're working on." He glanced toward the Chevy. "You ever used a ratchet?" "I was married for 20 years. Frank gave a slow smile. "That's not the same." Lillian walked over and stood beside him, pulling her sleeves up. "Show me." He handed her the ratchet. "Loosen this bolt here counterclockwise. Not too fast or it'll strip." She followed his instruction, tongue tucked slightly into her cheek in concentration. The bolt gave with a soft metallic groan. "There," she said triumphantly. "Not bad. I'll take that as high praise." Frank gave her a sideways glance. "Most folks wouldn't have asked. Most folks aren't trying to earn their keep in a garage with bad coffee." He laughed again, this time longer, easier. "You keep showing up with croissants, you might get promoted." "To what?" "Assistant grease monkey, apprentice." Sounds prestigious. They fell into an easy rhythm. Him explaining, her asking, both of them comfortable in the gentle give and take. At one point, he handed her a socket wrench without even looking, and she took it without hesitation. It felt strangely like they had done this for years, and somewhere in that rhythm, Frank felt something loosen. Not a bolt, not a tension rod, but something in his chest. A weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying. He didn't say anything, but he smiled, and she saw it. Around noon, Frank stepped away from the truck, wiped his hands, and leaned against the workbench. "You hungry?" "I could eat," Lillian replied, brushing a smudge of grease from her cheek. "I've got chili in the back room, left over but decent." She gave him a mock stern look. "Is this your way of asking me to lunch?" "No," he said deadpan. It's my way of keeping you from fainting in my garage. Romantic, he shrugged. It's a start. Lillian followed him into the office, where a small microwave and a battered old crockpot held court atop a filing cabinet. Frank ladled the chili into two mismatched bowls and handed her one. They ate in comfortable silence. She glanced at him, over the rim of her bowl. You ever think you'd be here, she asked, eating 3-day-old chili with a stranger in a garage? Something like that. He considered it. No, but it's not a bad place to be. She nodded. It's not. That afternoon, after she left, promising to return the next morning with blueberry muffins and more sarcasm, Frank sat in the garage alone, the warmth of her laughter still echoing in the corners. It had been years since he'd laughed like that. Years since he'd shared a day with someone who wasn't asking for something or trying to fix him. He picked up the ratchet she'd used and ran his thumb along the handle. Then he turned to the wall above the workbench, usually bare, and drove a nail into the wood. From it, he hung the small, grease-streaked rag Lillian had used to wipe her hands. It wasn't much, but it meant something. A reminder, maybe, that healing didn't always come like thunder. Sometimes it came like laughter, like shared silence, like someone asking what a ball-joint press was. Sometimes it came slow, but it came. The snow returned the following Tuesday, drifting lazily through the early morning stillness and laying a fresh blanket over the quiet streets of Willoughby. The flakes fell like the town expected them, soft, steady, with no particular urgency. Frank opened the garage at the usual time, his breath a fog in the cold air, as he cranked on the heater and filled the pot with water for coffee. It had become routine again, but now the rhythm was different. There were 2 mugs on the counter. Instead of one, a small jar of honey Lillian had left beside the sugar bowl. A folded crossword puzzle page she hadn't finished. These were her fingerprints, not literal but unmistakable. Quiet markers of her presence, markers that had begun to matter. By 8:15, he expected the soft chime of the bell. But it didn't. Come. Instead, at 8:27, the same sleek black SUV from weeks ago rolled slowly down the street and parked outside his garage. Frank's stomach tightened. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off. Then the door opened and a tall man stepped out. Dark coat, clean shoes, that same air of calculated calm. Lillian's son. Frank wiped his hands on a rag and met the man at the threshold, standing just under the garage bay door. "Morning," the man said. "I hope this isn't a bad time." Frank gave him a look. "It's a garage. They're all bad times." The man cracked a smile, brief and polite. "Fair enough." He stepped inside, glancing around like a man who didn't often find himself among grease and tools. "I'm David Hart," he said, offering his hand. Frank hesitated, then shook it. "I remember." David looked toward the workbench, the neatly stacked boxes, the humming space heater. "My mother speaks highly of you," he said. Frank didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth twitched, something between a smirk and a sigh. David continued. "She seems lighter, more grounded than I've seen her in a long time." Frank glanced at him. "She's strong, just needed room to breathe." David nodded. "She told me you declined the offer before." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Still, not interested in government work. It's not government. It's independent, veteran-owned. We contract with transitional housing programs and VA clinics, all focused on reintegration." "I'm not a reintegrator," Frank said. "You're a mechanic," David replied evenly. "One who knows how to fix more than just engines." Frank folded his arms. "I've been here a long time." "I know. And I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here because we're launching a program in Duluth. Fleet management, workshop training for vets who've aged out of the system, men who still want to work but aren't sure how to start again." Frank looked away. "We need someone steady, someone they'll respect, someone who's lived a life, not just studied it." David pulled out a folder and set it on the workbench. "No deadlines, no expectations, just look it over." Frank didn't touch it. David paused, then added, You helped my mother when no one else even saw her. This offer isn't a favor, it's a recognition." Frank studied him. This man who moved like he carried the weight of others for a living. He saw the same steadiness in David that he now saw in Lillian. A quiet resilience, the kind that could only come from surviving something you couldn't name. "I'll think about it," Frank said at last. David nodded. "That's all I ask." He started for the door, then paused. "She cares about you," he said softly. "I don't think she said it out loud, but she doesn't have to." Frank didn't move, didn't answer. He just watched as David stepped back out into the snow and disappeared into the SUV, the tires crunching softly as they pulled away. It was almost noon when Lillian finally arrived, her boots dusted white, cheeks pink from the cold. "Sorry, I'm late," she said, unwinding her scarf. "Had to wait for a train to pass, and I got distracted at the bookstore again." Frank was quiet. She looked up, immediately sensing something in his posture, too still, too guarded. "What is it?" He nodded toward the workbench. "Your son came by." Lillian stiffened. "Did he say why?" "Said they're starting a program in Duluth, veterans, workshop skills, gave me a folder." She swallowed. "He shouldn't have blindsided you." "He didn't. He was respectful." She studied him. "But it shook you." Frank turned, leaned against the workbench, arms folded. "I've spent the last 10 years convincing myself the world didn't need me anymore, that I'd done my part, that this garage was all I had left." Lillian stepped closer, voice gentle. "And now I'm not so sure." He glanced at her. "You ever get so used to the weight of something that when it starts to lift, you don't trust it?" "All the time," she said quietly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've told myself I was finished, that I had nothing left to give. But the truth is, I'm scared." "Of what?" He looked down. "Of starting again, of believing that something new could be just as meaningful as what I lost." She reached for his hand, warm and calloused in hers. "Starting again doesn't mean forgetting what came before," she said. "It means honoring it enough to build something from it." Frank looked at her for a long moment, eyes softening. "I'm not good at new beginnings. You don't have to be," she whispered. "You just have to be willing." That evening, long after Lillian had gone, Frank sat alone at the workbench with the folder David had left. He hadn't opened it yet. Outside, the snow fell thick and quiet, muffling the world. He picked up the folder and ran a thumb along the edge. He wasn't sure if he'd say yes. He wasn't sure if he could. But for the first time in years, he wasn't certain he'd say no. He opened the folder, and something inside him, something long quiet, stirred. The first time Frank closed the garage before sundown, in over a decade, it wasn't for a storm. It wasn't for a funeral or illness. It was by choice. At 2:17 p.m. on a Wednesday, he flipped the sign on the garage door to closed, grabbed his winter coat from the hook by the door and paused. He stared at his reflection in the garage window, not checking his appearance, but something deeper, as if trying to see the man he used to be and the man he might still become. Then he turned and stepped into the snow. The drive to Duluth was long and quiet. 2 hours on winding roads, flanked by tall pines and wide fields blanketed in white. The sun was already slanting low in the sky, casting gold across the snowbanks. Frank drove without the radio on, letting the hum of the truck and the rhythm of his thoughts keep him company. In the passenger seat sat a worn leather folder, the one David had given him, now filled with dog-eared pages, pencil notes in the margins, and a printed schedule clipped to the front. Veteran Workshop Orientation, Duluth Center. It felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life, or maybe stepping back into his own after being away too long. He arrived just before 5. The building was nondescript, an old converted warehouse tucked into a quiet part of town. A faded American flag flapped in the cold wind. The parking lot was half full, a mix of old pickups and military-grade vans. As Frank stepped inside, warmth hit him in a wave, the smell of coffee, fresh paint, and something else. Hope, maybe. A kind of quiet energy. A young man in a flannel shirt looked up from behind a folding table. "You here for orientation?" Frank nodded. "Name's Frank Mercer." The man smiled. "Glad to have you, sir. Just sign in and grab a badge. Coffee's in the back, snacks on the left. Folks are filtering in." Frank signed his name with a steady hand, the letters unfamiliar, but firm. In the meeting room, half a dozen veterans had already gathered. Most looked to be in their 50s or older, weathered men with strong shoulders and tired eyes. A few younger faces dotted the group, a mix of uncertainty and restlessness in their posture. Frank found a seat near the back, not out of hesitation, but habit. David Hart stood near the front, arms folded, speaking with a coordinator. When he saw Frank, his expression didn't change much, just a brief flicker of approval in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement between men who didn't waste words. The orientation began with simple introductions, who they were, why they were, here, what they hoped to learn. Most had come to keep busy or find a purpose. A few wanted to learn practical skills. One older man said plainly, "My wife told me if I don't find something to do with my hands, she'll find something for me." Laughter rippled across the room. Frank hadn't expected to laugh, but when his turn came, he stood and said simply, "I'm Frank Mercer, mechanic for 40 years, Army motor pool before that. Been running a little garage in Willoughby since. The dinosaurs roamed. I'm not here to start over. I'm just here to help if I can." Another chuckle, this time warmer. A man in the front row nodded. "Sometimes that's all we need." They broke into groups afterward. Hands-on rotations, skill assessments, light bench work. Frank found himself beside a younger vet named Luis, maybe mid-30s, who'd recently finished a stint in transitional housing. "Been a while since I picked up a wrench," Luis admitted, turning the tool awkwardly in his hand. Frank offered a quiet nod. "Then we'll take it slow." He walked Luis through the basics, how to brace the bolt, how not to over-tighten, how to let the tool do the work. Frank didn't lecture. He demonstrated, observed, offered corrections without condescension. By the end of the hour, Luis had fixed a starter motor. He beamed. "Didn't think I had that in me." Frank smiled. "You did." The rest of the session passed in a blur. More introductions, more quiet encouragement. By the time the workshop wrapped up, Frank's hands smelled like metal and oil again. And for the first time in years, his shoulders didn't ache from the weight of silence, but from use. David approached him as the others filtered out. "You were good in there," he said. "Really good." Frank shrugged. "They were eager to learn. Because you gave them someone worth learning from." Frank didn't argue, just looked out the window toward the snowy lot. "I don't know if I'm ready to do this every week," he admitted. "You don't have to decide today," David said. "But they'd be lucky to have you." Frank gave a nod, then picked up his coat. As he turned to leave, David added, "My mother said you don't like being called a mentor." "I don't," Frank replied without missing a beat. David smiled. "That's what makes you one." The drive back was quiet. Night had fallen fast, and the roads glowed under the headlights like a path unfolding 1 mile at a time. Frank didn't think of the garage. He didn't think of the to-do list taped to his fridge or the familiar ache in his knees. He thought of Luis. He thought of the look on that young man's face when the starter motor whirred to life. That flicker of pride, of possibility, he thought. Of how it felt to be useful again, not just competent but needed. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that. By the time he pulled back into Willoughby, it was near midnight. The town was asleep. The garage stood in quiet silhouette, the porch light casting a warm circle on the snow, but the office window was glowing. Frank stepped inside and found Lillian curled on the old bench seat near the stove, half asleep with a book in her lap and a blanket draped over her legs. The scent of chamomile hung in the air. She stirred at the sound of the door. "Hey," she said softly. "I thought I'd wait for you." Frank hung his coat and sat across from her. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." They sat in silence for a beat. Then Frank said, "It was good." She looked at him. "I didn't think I'd want to go back," he continued. "Didn't think I'd have anything left to give." "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I think maybe I was just waiting for the right place to give it." She reached for his hand. "I'm proud of you." He held her hand gently, weathered palm against hers. "I think I might be proud of me too." Frank woke before the sun, as always, but now, instead of cold silence greeting him in the dark, there was the faint aroma of something warm, something cinnamon-sweet, drifting in from the kitchen corner of the garage office. The sound of soft humming trailed just beneath it, like wind rustling through familiar trees. He stretched, joints creaking, and sat up slowly on the cot. Lillian stood at the hot plate, wearing one of his old flannels, sleeves rolled clumsily over her wrists, and stirring something in a pan. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes still soft with sleep, but her presence filled the space with a quiet kind of warmth. "You're up early," he murmured, voice gravelly with sleep. She looked over her shoulder and smiled. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd surprise you." "I don't do surprises before coffee." She lifted a mug from the table and handed it to him. "Then you're in luck." Frank took it, sipped, and raised an eyebrow. "You finally figured out how to make it drinkable." "I added cinnamon and mercy," she said. "You're welcome." He chuckled and sat down on the bench seat. Outside, the snow had stopped sometime during the night, and pale morning light was just beginning to creep through the garage windows. The whole town lay still under a layer of white, undisturbed and expectant. "What's in the pan?" he asked. "French toast, kind of." "I improvised," Frank smirked. "Dangerous words." Lillian plated the toast and brought it over. They ate side by side, knees nearly touching, hands warming around their mugs. The only sounds were the occasional scrape of a fork, the whisper of wind outside, and the subtle, steady rhythm of two people learning to exist together without the need to fill every silence. Later that morning, after breakfast and a half-hearted attempt at cleaning the hot plate, Frank opened the garage bay as he always did. But this time, Lillian didn't leave right away. Instead, she pulled up a stool near the workbench and picked up a paperback she'd started 3 days earlier, a dog-eared mystery with a missing cat and an implausible detective. Frank eyed her. "You planning to just sit there and supervise?" She looked over the rim of her book. "Someone has to make sure you don't sabotage your own alternators." He smirked. "You gonna start charging rent?" "Only if the coffee goes bad." Again, they shared a look. One of those quiet, shared jokes that required no explanation. Frank turned back to the car on the lift, and for the next hour they worked in tandem. He with his tools, she with her pages, each occasionally breaking the rhythm with a dry comment or a passing smile. It was unremarkable, simple, but in that simplicity something profound began to take root. Around mid-morning, Joe Palmer, an old customer and former trucker with more opinions than teeth, rolled in with a whining belt on his Dodge Ram. Frank stepped out to greet him, wiping his hands on a cloth. Lillian stayed back, but Frank could feel her presence just behind him, like a steady shadow. "What you got today, Joe?" "Same damn squeal I've had since '08, Joe grunted. "Only louder." Frank popped the hood. "You ignore it long enough, it'll start harmonizing." Joe snorted, then looked past Frank to Lillian. "She your new apprentice?" Before Frank could respond, Lillian grinned. "Only if he gives me a raise," Joe chuckled. "She's sharp. Keep her around." Frank shot her a glance. "That's the plan." It slipped out before he even realized it. And when he saw Lillian's eyes catch the words and hold them gently, he didn't pull them back. They worked on Joe's truck together, Frank handling the belt tension, Lillian handing him tools with increasing familiarity. When they were done, Joe handed Frank a crumpled 10 and a container of homemade pickles. For the lady, he said with a wink. She hates pickles, Frank replied. No, I don't, Lillian interjected. Frank raised an eyebrow. Since when? Since just now. They laughed, all three of them, and Joe pulled away waving, his truck still growling faintly as it disappeared into the slush. As the day wore on, the light grew golden through the windows, casting soft shadows across the garage floor. Frank cleaned his hands at the sink while Lillian refilled the coffee pot. You really thinking of doing the Duluth thing? She asked. Frank nodded slowly. Every week or so, just to get started. She leaned against the counter. It suits you? He looked at her. Teaching. No, she said softly. Living again. Frank dried his hands, then stepped closer. You helped me find that again, you know. She didn't answer, just reached out and touched his hand. They stood there for a while, not in silence but in something better, in the stillness that comes when two people have nothing left to hide and nothing left to prove. That evening, they closed the garage together, Lillian flipping the sign while Frank locked the tool cabinets. He turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the soft glow of the stove in the office, where they settled with 2 bowls of soup and a shared blanket across their legs. Outside, the sky faded into velvet blue. Inside, everything felt just right. Lillian rested her head on Frank's shoulder. This, she whispered, feels like home. Frank exhaled slowly. Yeah, it does. He didn't mean the garage or even the soup. He meant her, the mornings with her, the quiet, the laughter, the being, and for the first time in what felt like 100 winters, he wasn't waiting for something else to begin. He wasn't measuring the past against what could have been. He was present, fully, and in that presence he found peace, not the kind born from stillness, but the kind born from sharing the stillness. The first real day of spring arrived without fanfare. No bright blossoms or warm breezes, just the absence of cold. The snow had receded, and the streets of Willoughby emerged again from their long winter hush. Puddles dotted the sidewalks. Birds returned in fits and flutters, and the scent of thawed earth whispered promise. Frank stood in front of the garage, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a rare warmth touching his skin. The morning sun struck the windows just right, turning the ordinary glass into something golden. Inside, the familiar whirring of the heater was quiet now, finally given a rest. The stove had been cleaned, the old cot folded and put away, and the space had taken on a new rhythm, not just his anymore. He turned as the bell above the door jingled. Lillian stepped in, hair loose around her shoulders, carrying 2 coffees and a small brown envelope. You're late, Frank said. I'm precisely on time. For what? She held out the envelope. Frank opened it and pulled out a photograph, printed, slightly grainy. It showed him and Louise standing side by side in the Duluth workshop. Louise was grinning, holding up a rebuilt starter motor like it was a trophy. Frank looked, well, as frank as ever, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. They mailed that to me, Lillian said. Louise wrote on the back. Want to read it? Frank flipped it over. Mr. Mercer, thanks for making me feel like I still matter. You didn't just teach me tools. You helped me pick up the pieces. Frank stared at the words for a long time. Then he folded the photo gently and slid it into the front pocket of his overalls. Good kid, he muttered. Lillian smiled. You matter too, you know. I'm starting to believe that. They worked together that day, Lillian handling the phone and the new invoice software, which Frank still insisted wasn't, fixing what wasn't broken, while Frank replaced a timing belt on a farmer's old F-150. They took lunch by the open garage bay, legs stretched out, sandwiches balanced on their knees. You ever think about retiring? She asked, out of the blue. Frank chewed thoughtfully. Once or twice. Then I get an engine in here that hasn't been touched since Reagan, and I remember why I like the work. She laughed. You'd miss it. I'd miss you more. It slipped out, natural, unguarded. He didn't flinch. Lillian blinked. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me since the Clinton administration. Frank gave her a look. You always have to ruin the moment. Only the overly sentimental ones. But she was smiling, deeply, truly, and she reached for his hand. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the world, in soft orange and violet, Frank stood by the garage window with a worn paintbrush in hand. The new sign had arrived earlier that week, carved wood, handcrafted by a local artisan Lillian had found at the Sunday market. He mounted it carefully, step by slow step, measuring twice, driving the screws with quiet precision. The words on the sign read, Mercer and Hart Auto. We keep more than engines running. Lillian stood beside him, arms crossed, head tilted. It's perfect, she whispered. Frank took a step back, hands on his hips. Took me a while to agree. To it. You don't like your name being out front? I didn't want it to be just mine. She turned to him. It never was. The next morning, a boy knocked at the garage door, just as Frank was wiping down the workbench. Barely 15, all elbows and oversized sweatshirt, a little dirt smudged on his chin. You, Frank? I am. I heard you might take on apprentices. Frank raised a brow. Who told you that? Luis. From Duluth. He said you taught him how to find his way back. Frank looked at the boy for a long moment, saw the fear under the bravado, the longing to be seen, a reflection of so many faces he'd once known, and of a younger version of himself, standing on the edge of something unknown. He reached under the bench and grabbed a spare apron, tossed it to the boy. You know how to hold a ratchet? The boy caught the apron. Not yet. Frank nodded. Good. We'll start with that. As the boy stepped into the garage, Frank caught Lillian watching from the office doorway, a smile touching the corners of her lips. New hire, she asked. Probationary. Think he'll make it? Frank glanced at the boy, fumbling with the apron ties. Maybe, if he learns not to tighten everything just because he can. Lillian laughed. You're talking about bolts, right? Frank gave her a look. Not just bolts. That night Frank sat in his chair by the stove, legs stretched, coffee cooling beside him. Lillian was reading, toes tucked beneath her, her presence a quiet constant. The garage was still. The wind outside had softened to a breeze. Somewhere in town someone was playing a radio, just loud enough to catch the whisper of a slow country ballad. Frank let out a long breath, not of exhaustion but of contentment, the kind that comes when everything, for once, feels in place. You know, he said, I used to think life had seasons. It does. No, I mean, I thought the seasons came in order. Spring, summer, fall, winter, youth, middle, old age, but I think I got that wrong. Lillian looked up from her book. Maybe spring doesn't come after winter. Maybe it comes when you're ready, even if it's late. She smiled, closed her book, and leaned her head on his shoulder. Then I'm glad we made it here, she said. Frank nodded. Me too. And in the stillness of the garage, in the smell of oil and fresh coffee and new beginnings, Frank Mercer, for the first time in a long, long time, let himself believe in everything that still lay ahead. Not because of what he'd lost, but because of what he'd chosen to keep. I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Are you tuning in from a small town like Willoughby? Or maybe from a quiet corner of the city where stories like this bring a little calm to your day? Share it in the comments below. It always warms my heart to see where this little storytelling journey is reaching. And if this story touched you, even just a little, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it lets me keep bringing stories like The Quiet Garage, The Loud Heart to life for listeners just like you. Thank you truly for spending this time with me, whether you were here for the whole journey or just a single chapter. Your presence matters. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.